Now that you have done this activity, you must have noticed how the learning objectives can and do fall in either cognitive domain or affective domain or psychomotor domain. And sometimes you might find certain objectives which have combinations of these. Now, having talked about the objectives of learning or learning objectives, let us move towards principles of learning. Now, we all know that we have moved from teacher-centric approach to learner-centric approach to teaching, and hence understanding the principles of learning do matter. Herb Simon says that learning results from what the student does and thinks, and only from what the student does and thinks. The teacher can advance learning only by influencing what the students can do to learn. Now let us take a look at all these principles one by one. Students' prior knowledge can help or hinder learning. Now, how can we determine what students already know and how can we use this information in our teaching? These are the two very important questions here. Now, when the prior knowledge is activated, sufficient, appropriate and accurate, it helps learning. As teachers, we can notice this in the class that whether the learner's knowledge is activated, whether the learner's knowledge is sufficient, whether it is appropriate or it is accurate. If it does, then it does help learning. At the same time, when we know that the knowledge is exactly opposite of this, that is, it is inactive, it is insufficient, it is inappropriate and it is inaccurate, then it certainly hinders learning. As educators, we have to look for those hints in learners' prior knowledge. The second principle is how students organize knowledge influences how they learn and apply what they know. And this is really a big challenge for an educator to understand that how actually learners organize their knowledge. Some learners are very good at organizing their knowledge, some learners are not. Those who can organize their knowledge very well, they can learn better and faster. And those who cannot, they do not learn better and faster. For them, learning becomes a difficult task. And it is at this point that we as educators need to know and need to help our learners to organize their knowledge in better way. Students who have rich, meaningful knowledge structures have better learning and performance. And students who tend to build sparse, superficial knowledge structures need to develop the rich base of knowledge structures. The third principle is that knowledge organizations vary in terms of relationships among individual pieces of knowledge. How can we get our students to reveal their organizational structures? Or how can we use this information in our teaching? We need to engage our learners or our students to see how exactly they organize their knowledge, whether the knowledge that they have organized is in isolation or whether there is a kind of coherence that they are able to create. If the learners are not able to organize their knowledge, we need to help them to contribute to that and to create an organizational structure. We have to design our teaching in such a way that the learners realize, learners get to learn to organize their knowledge. The next principle is that students' motivation determines, directs and sustains what they do to learn. I'm sure that all of us actually will agree on this fact that motivation makes a lot of difference in learning. Motivation leads to goal-directed behavior and hence supports learning and performance. Learners who are less motivated will less participate in the act of learning. Learners who are more motivated, who are intrinsically motivated or who are internally motivated, they will have more participation in learning. So, as teachers, what we need to do? As teachers, we have to figure out what motivates our learners. And then ensure that the things which motivate our learners should become part of their learning experience. We can use this information in our teaching and keep motivating our learners. The next principle is to develop mastery. Students must acquire first component skills, then they should practice integrating them, and they should know when to apply what they have learned. Let us try and understand this by taking an example. Suppose you are dealing with language students who are actually developing their proficiency skills in language. Their component skill is basically knowing the linguistic skills, knowing pronunciation, knowing grammar, knowing sentence structure. Now, once students acquire these component skills, they should be able to practice them by integrating them. Probably no learner learns language just by listening, just by reading, just by speaking, just by writing. There is a need to integrate all these skills together. And the next stage, which is very important, that is the pragmatic use of language, is that you should allow the learners to make use of this language in different situations where they can apply the existing knowledge that they have. That is when they will know how to apply the kind of knowledge that they have learned in the classroom. Now, this takes us to the next principle of learning. As students gain competence within a domain, they first gain and then lose conscious awareness of the skills that they are exercising. This can be explained by this diagram, where you can see that the first level of the learner is his unconscious knowledge of his or her incompetence. The second stage is that of his conscious or her conscious knowledge of her or his incompetence. Then what we see is the next level, where he or she is conscious of the competence that he or she is gaining. And the last stage that you see is that of unconsciousness of the competence that the learner has gained. How can we monitor the development of mastery? Now, as educators, we have very good observation skills. Now, we have to keep alert, we have to keep our eyes and our ears open in the classroom and see what level is your learner. Whether the learner is unconscious of the incompetence. If yes, then we need to develop the technique in which the learner becomes conscious of the incompetence. Once your learner is conscious of this incompetence, you have to make sure that the learner is promoted, learner is encouraged to develop certain competence. Probably it is in the same way as we all learn, those of us who actually like swimming, how we learn. We are absolutely incompetent when it comes in the beginning. When you are learning, you are quite conscious of everything that you do. And slowly, once you start practicing swimming, it becomes your unconscious competence. Now, you may not realize that how well you swim, but you have acquired this ability, acquired this competence of swimming effectively. Now, you can apply the same logic to even mastering the skill of typewriting, and so on and so forth. And that is how we can use the same approach in teaching in the classroom. Then the next principle of learning is goal-directed practice coupled with targeted feedback, the quality of students' learning. How can we provide targeted feedback within the constraints that we have? First, that we need to realize that the practice needs to be goal-directed. There has to be a set goal. It is this goal that actually directs the kind of practice learners need to undertake. Now, while the learners are practicing, that a teacher can always give a targeted feedback which will enhance the understanding of the learner, and the learner will be able to grasp the subject or the area for which the learner is making an attempt. And so it becomes very important that we promote practice by giving such targeted feedback to our learners. The next principle of learning says that students' current level of development interacts with the social, emotional, and intellectual climate of the course to impact learning. Now, as teachers, what we need to do is that we need to create classroom environments that can take into account students' development and enhance learning. Now, again here, as educators, our observations are very important. It's only through our observation that we can realize the different levels of development that the learners have. So how can we create classroom environments that take into account students' development and enhance their learning? As I mentioned earlier, and I mention it now again, that we as educators have to use our observation skills. We have to observe in the classroom as to what level of development your learner is. And it is this input which will be incorporated into your classroom environment. This takes us to the last principle of learning, which says to become self-directed learners, students must learn to monitor and adjust their approaches to learning. I believe that this is very important aspect of learning, and especially in higher education, that our learners should become autonomous. And this autonomy does not come automatically. It has to be nurtured, it has to be cultivated, and as educators, as teachers, it becomes our responsibility to develop learning skills among our learners. We need to teach them how to learn on themselves. And this autonomy will allow the learners to take charge of their own learning situations. We can only promote the development of self-directed learners. And if we do that, we actually succeed in achieving one of the objectives of teaching in higher education. Well, now let us have a recap of all the principles that we discussed so far. So the principle 1 is prior knowledge, principle number 2 is organization of knowledge, principle number 3 is motivation, principle number 4 is development of mastery, principle number 5 is practice and feedback, and principle number 6 is the whole student. The last one is metacognition. I said this earlier and I repeat that it is not teaching that causes learning. Attempts by the learner to perform causes learning, dependent upon the quality of feedback and opportunities to use. Now, these principles of learning will always remind us of the fact that how learning can be initiated, facilitated by our teaching in a better way.